I have a former Trump cabinet member with inside information to help us understand what the heck is going on in the United States, what's going on with Donald Trump, and his different situations. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, just some background for my audience. David Bernhardt is an author, writer. He served in the Bush administration and also served as the 53rd Secretary of the U.S. Department of Interior under former President Donald Trump. If you don't mind, David, I'd like to just maybe understand you worked for George W. Bush, which I believe among Republicans would be considered the old guard, and also under Donald Trump, who people might consider the new guard. Can you tell us, did you notice any difference between these two Republican presidents, and what was your experience?
So I really did, and that's a really interesting question. And just to give you a little background before I jump into it, I had the opportunity to serve 8 years at the Department of the Interior as a political appointee during the Bush administration, and I held a number of jobs there. But the final one was I was the solicitor of the department, which is their chief counsel or general counsel. And then in the lead up to, I served in the Romney transition team, served in the Trump transition team, and then went in and was deputy secretary for the first 2 years of the Trump administration and Interior, and then secretary for the last 2 years. And so what I was able to see, and I write about this in my book, which is called You Report to Me, Accountability for a Failing Administrative State. And what I really highlighted and what was striking to me was the difference in management style between President Trump and President Bush in terms of dealing directly with the cabinet secretaries and what that meant for outcomes. And what I use in the book, I use a couple of examples that I lived through. And in the Bush, George W. Bush administration, if a secretary wanted, at least at Interior, I can't speak for all secretaries, but if the Secretary of the Interior wanted to see the president or confer with the president about a particular issue, it could be quite an arduous process to get there. As a matter of fact, I worked on two episodes, and one of which I explain in the book, where it literally took months between the time the secretary asked for the meeting and the time he eventually met with the president. And what that means in an administration is that, in an administration, one term is 1,461 days. And if you are spending months just waiting to have a discussion about an issue, the issues fester, the issues become harder. And in contrast to that experience in the George W. Bush White House, which was really just layers upon layers of bureaucracy in the White House itself to get to a decision meeting. In the Trump administration, my experience was that I dealt directly with the president immediately. And as a matter of fact, I open the book that I published with a vignette where I receive notice to come over and meet with the president. And I'm the deputy secretary, and my boss is resigning or getting fired. It's sort of up in the air at the time, what's happening. And I go over and meet with the president. I sit down with him, and we have a discussion, which I detail in the book. And we get to the end of the discussion, and he basically tells me, "Look, you're going to be acting secretary for a while." And he asked me if I have any questions, and I say, "I have one." I say, "Who do I report to?" And he looks at me a little bit confused, and he says, "Well, you report to me." And I say, "Well, with all due respect, I understand that's what the Constitution says, and I appreciate that, but I'm just a flunky who needs to get my work done. So who do I who do I really report to?" "Me," he says. And we go back and forth on this a minute, and I'm actually confused because I knew that's not the way the George W. Bush White House had worked at all. And I took over. I became acting secretary in early January of 2018. And people won't remember this really, but it was during the longest government shutdown in history. And so becoming the leader of an agency when the government is theoretically closed is, it's like taking commission of a ship when literally no one's on it, but the ship is sort of lurching forward. And I made the decision after analyzing some things to reopen some national parks during that period of time. And I knew that was going to be really controversial. And so which meant the White House would read about it, right? And so I sat in my desk and I'm like, who do I call? And I ultimately decided I would call the president's office directly. And I did. And I talked to his secretary and I'm like, look, I need to make sure the president's aware of this. I'm the new JV quarterback. I'm not really sure he needs to know, but I don't want him to surprise. So if you could just tell me who to really talk to, that'd be great. And she said to me, the president will give you a call back in 15 or 20 minutes. And I was almost dismissive of that, like it would not happen. And the time goes by, I get this call from the White House. And here's what was really astonishing to me about President Trump. I laid out to him my situation. And the first thing he said, which I thought was really interesting, he's like, well, David, we've been in the shutdown now for X number of days. And, if this was such a good idea, why didn't you do it sooner? Which is a really legitimate question for a supervisor to ask you, right? And so I kind of explained how we got there and, there had been a transition. That was great. And then he said, this looks like it's going to be a controversial decision. I said, it is. And he said, David, you're really new on this job. I'm not sure you should take any heat on this. Maybe you should, when you do it, you should say that I directed you to do it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, I'm not sure that's really the way the org chart is supposed to work with bad news, Mr. President. But, and then 3, he said this, and this was stunning to me. He says, now, David, you're running the Department of the Interior. So if you have something you need to do and you think it's a good idea, do it, and then let me know when you've done it. And as I hung up the phone, I sat there and thought, just think about this a minute. Any subordinate wants to know from their supervisor, number one, hey, am I on top of your issues? He asked me good questions about why I was doing what I was doing and why I hadn't done it earlier. That's a fair question. 2, he was offering to provide some cover, if you will, which is the support any subordinate wants. And 3, he was saying, get on and do your job. You're enabled to do it and push it. And for the next 2 years, that's precisely how I ran the Department of the Interior. And doing that during that time, whenever I needed to visit with him about an issue, I received a call back within 24 hours. Now, you might think that 24 hours seems like a long time for response time. But, I was at the Department of the Interior, and I used to think that's a really important job, right? I mean, like if you're the secretary, you think it's a really important job to serve the American people in that capacity. But I always thought, like, let's say I call him at 3:00 in the afternoon. Where am I on his call list at 3:00 in the afternoon? Like, am I, I'm sure there's, Mrs. Trump, and then, leaders from foreign countries, the State Department. Where did the Secretary of Interior rank on that call list? And I always received a call back in 24 hours. And what did that mean? That meant that I could give him my input, get his input, make a decision and keep moving, and move at a speed that was beyond belief, honestly. And so here's the outcome of that experience. In 8 years, I worked 8 years at Interior under George W. Bush, 4 years under Donald J. Trump. And in the 4 years with Donald J. Trump, we outperformed, and you can give me any metric, and I'm happy to go through them with you. We outperformed in that 4-year period the productivity of the 8-year period.
Wow.
And that's just because the bureaucracy, he freed up the internal White House bureaucracy and was willing to make decisions and enable you to proceed forward. And that was an incredible experience in terms of managing the government. And it's a really unusual leadership trait, I believe. It's an unusual application of the presidency. And it's very, very different, I think, than the current administration, frankly.
Yeah, I saw a video recently where it showed how the media was covering Trump his first 100 days. You had people like Jake Tapper at CNN saying, "We've never seen a president get so much done. People can't keep up with this president. This president just got a year's worth of work done in the last 30 days." And then all of a sudden it came to a grinding halt, and everyone fell into this Hillary Clinton invented Russia collusion story.
That's actually true.
Which threw everything off. I'm just curious, based on what you've shared with me, 2 things. Do you think Trump running a hotel hospitality business is what led to some of these leadership and personality traits? And then secondly, do you think that Donald Trump is misunderstood because the media works so hard to not only destroy him, but paint him as somebody other than who he really is?
Well, so first off, and I'll answer both questions, but I think the answer to both truly is yes, just at the top. But the hospitality business point that you just made, I think is something that is really misunderstood about Trump. And here's why. And I highlight this in my book when I talk about the very first vignette that I mentioned. I was very uncomfortable the first time I walked into the Oval Office, like alone. I mean, I'm walking in, I don't know the situation. Frankly, I didn't know if I was getting hired or fired. And so I sit down and I'm clearly uncomfortable in the meeting. And the president immediately recognized that. And he spent a few minutes just getting me calmed down, which is actually pretty remarkable when you think about it. Here you have the president of the United States, and he's saying, "Hey, you want a Coke? Hey, let's do some chit chat." And I sat there. My first thought was, this is him as a host, wanting to make sure that this customer, guest, client, employee, subordinate, whatever you want to think about for that moment, is in a good place before they have a discussion. And from that moment on, honestly, as I watched him, as when you do an event with him, he's sort of emceeing, he gets people involved. If you watch a rally with him, it's him, and then everybody, he's pulling people up on stage. I really believe that on one hand, his delivery mechanisms were really honed in that environment that you say. Conversely, equally the case, I believe he viewed cabinet agencies as basically, and I mean this in a good way, not it's obviously they weren't for-profit institutions, but I believe when he picked a cabinet secretary and they were confirmed, he was basically saying, "You're the president of this business unit, and I want you to really perform." And what he wanted is he had outcomes that he wanted, and he was clear about what those outcomes would be. And frankly, as long as you were delivering on those outcomes, just as if you were a subunit performing as a company, he was phenomenal to work with. I think the challenge became like, if you had outcomes and you weren't meeting the outcomes, if things came up. But I really enjoyed working with him because he was focused on delivering outcomes to the American people. He could get frustrated with, discussions about process and not results. But everything he did was done, in my opinion, or at least in my experience, it was done to drive to, where are you on energy? Where are you on conservation stewardship? Where are you on access? Where are we on deregulation? And you know, the government needs somebody that's asking, you know, are we performing? And that all came, I believe, that it largely came from his experience in business, and it was, you know, I found it to be a very positive experience to have the chance to work with somebody that said, look, I want to deliver for the American people. I want outcomes. And if you're not giving me outcomes, like, you better have a good answer. And like, that's what our country needs. And, or at least I believe that's what our country needs. And so, you know, that's where I was. Now, your second question, I'm sorry, I got on this tangent, but the second question was what?
The second question was, do you think that he is a misunderstood
Oh
individual?
yes, I really do. I really think that he. I think there's two ways to look at it. Number one, he's an incredible entertainer. He's incredible, and you may think good, bad, or indifferent, but a lot of things he does are, you know, with a little humor that maybe doesn't come across as humor all the time, a little sarcasm. But, you know, the truth of the matter is, when you deal with him on serious issues, my experience with him is, number one, if you give him the information, he would listen. Okay. Now, he felt entitled to make the decisions that were in his decision space, which he should. But I never had an instance, like, for example, he might say, I'd like to do X. And you can say, well, you know, that's interesting, Mr. President, but could I do X this way? Sure, go do that. Get out of my office. You know, he's so outcome determined. Now, if you told him that you couldn't do X because of a bunch of process, he might get like, you know, well, fix the process or figure it out. If you told him you couldn't do it because of a legal issue, he'd be like, well, how do we fix that? Do you go to Congress? What do you do? And so you know, you had to understand, from my perspective, you really had to understand how to run your division or your agency if you're going to tell him you couldn't do something. And I think that's appropriate. Like, that's what you would hope the president is doing. And we have a lot of figureheads in public policy in these positions. And I'm not picking on any particular administration, but they come in and they just think that, you know, they're there to lead on autopilot. Like, it's not really leading, but there's 70,000 people at the Department of the Interior. They're churning out, and this person's going to show up and do ribbon cuttings. And like, that wasn't probably going to work if you were working for Trump. He's going to want you to come up with some results.
Okay, interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, let's do some lightning round, because I've got like 5 or 6 questions that I want to hear from you. You worked over the interior. President Biden and his White House over and over again say that they are doing absolutely everything they can to lower inflation and make gas more affordable, yet they're blocking permits, revoking permits for oil and gas. They've just now blocked projects that were planning to go forward in Alaska. How does the president say he's doing all these things for the American people out of one side of his mouth, and then out of the other, he's literally throwing every roadblock he can in order to slow it down or stop it from improving life for Americans?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the real issue there is that this administration is fundamentally hostile to particularly traditional fuel sources coming from America, which is absolutely stunning to me. I mean, to think about, you know, we have, in fairness, production has gone up over their period of time, but it's not gone up nearly what it would have under the Trump administration. There's no question about that. Production would be much higher today. If you just go back and look at EIA's estimates of where they thought things were headed, projected out to today versus where they are. So they've stifled production, which means that you have energy that needs to come from other places in the world with a, you know, more questionable legal regime, frankly, and regulatory regime. And then also America doesn't benefit from that economic activity here. You know, it's American jobs. If you look at economic growth in the 2000s, what you see is the technological revolution associated with energy production was a big driver of our entire early, 2004 to 2017 economic, productivity. And this administration is blatantly hostile to it. That means costs are higher. People see that it's not only in fuel costs. I mean, it's in your groceries. It's in, everything is very, very energy dependent. And what they've done is they've decided that they have a vision of where we should go with addressing in their mind climate issues, and that's to an energy policy of scarcity and deep expense. And you can see the American people are beginning to push back against this a little bit. We're seeing this in EVs, we're seeing it across the board, and really what you should do, in my opinion, is just let the market work. Let new technology come forward without massive government subsidies. And if it's a better mousetrap, the American people will ultimately use it. But our energy policy should be driven by the needs, by the laws we have, and just let the process work. And that's where we would end up in a far better place in America. There's no question about that.
Okay. When Donald Trump says on day one, he's going to order changes that will close and protect the border, and he's also going to drill, baby, drill. Do you believe that he is telling the truth, or are those just talking points to get reelected?
Oh, I think it's beyond. I mean, the one thing we're in a very unusual situation with this upcoming election, and truthfully, only the campaign and he can tell you precisely what he's going to do. But here's my my view of this. We've really never had a situation, in at least your or my lifetime, where you have a candidate who's running for president that has previously ran for president and basically done what he said he was going to do, or sure as heck tried. And so when Trump says, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, you really need to take it for a sense of, like, he means it. And what he means, I think, specifically on energy, as he's laid out in his Agenda 47, and when he says that, I think what he really means is and I'm not speaking for him, but I think it means I'm going to exercise all of the authority I have as president to direct that these agencies immediately reverse and head in the direction that I set under my administration in 2017 or 2019 or 2020. And what that, that's a known, like, you can know what those policies are. You don't have to guess at them. And so everything that Biden has done that's been hostile to the development of energy on public lands, in my opinion, are things that, like, are going to be in day one, like, go get done, future secretary or future EPA director. And so I would expect that he would act very, very quickly. And I mean, I can't say with certainty, but I would say I could not be more confident in that happening than I am that I will wake up and have breakfast tomorrow morning.
Okay. Does the Department of Interior have anything to do with the border? I know that's mostly Border Patrol, Department of Homeland Security. The reason I ask is I read this morning that Denver's hospitals are on the verge of bankruptcy because of all of the illegal immigrants. The medical system is completely strained in New York City. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida just announced this morning that they've spent almost $500 million on illegal immigrants' hospital bills in just 4 months. Is it sustainable, all of the illegals that are coming in and how they are taking advantage of these systems that Americans that have lived here their whole lives have been paying into, and they've been gradually building. And now all of a sudden, boom, it's almost like an attack with just the number of people needing services that citizens used to be able to get readily.
So number one, it is not sustainable. And the impacts are, I mean, what you're talking about are social impacts, which we see. I mean, we're seeing them on the news. My daughter goes to the University of Georgia, which was, impacted very significantly in a very personal way. So those impacts are real. But let me tell you some other impacts that are just shocking. The environmental impacts on the border itself are quite significant when you have that type of traffic and an incursion of waste. As a matter of fact, in the Trump administration, one of the things that, and I highlight this story in the book, one of the things that we actually did in Interior is the Department of Defense asked us for administrative jurisdiction of particular pieces of property. The Department of the Interior manages about 1 in every 5 acres of land in the United States, and some of that land is along the boundary and along the border. And so what we did is we had to go through a process of transferring administrative jurisdiction, and to do that requires the development of materials and inspection to allow that to happen, and that can take a long time. And I actually personally flew down to the border and did that inspection myself and wrote the decision to transfer those properties. And in doing that, I was stunned about the amount of environmental impacts that occur from the activity of all of these people coming across fish and wildlife refuges, national park land. It is just stunning, but it's tremendously burdensome to our society. And the way Interior has helped in those instances beyond jurisdictional issues is, some of our law enforcement officers were deployed to the border. And at the end of the day, the states are doing that with the National Guard. There has to be a commitment. And for us to really get a hold of this situation, at the end of the day, the president, with a stroke of his pen, could go back to remain in Mexico, could put pressure on Mexico. Just remember that Mexico was really maintaining the security of that border in terms of incursions when the Trump administration was here. And this is one of those things where a president just simply has not decided to exercise his authority and negotiate the way he wants to. Now that will address future folks coming in. What Trump is also talking about is, look, we're going to deal with the people that are here inappropriately and illegally, and that is will require a really, really big effort. At the end of the day, many of these people are coming here for the great reason that we all come here, right? Or our forefathers came. It's great economic opportunity, great hope. America is a wonderful place to come, but America should also be a nation of rules and laws, and we should want people to follow those laws. And there's a whole bunch of people that have been trying to get into America through a process of actually going through the lawful process. And we sure as heck should be letting those people, if we're going to let anybody in, it ought to be those people first. And so my view is, if you begin with a notion that you just let the lawlessness start at day one and continue, our society is in big, big trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. In our remaining minutes, David, tell me about your book, You Report to Me. I know that you talk about this unelected bureaucrats, the rule makers that most of us don't know about. Tell us about the book. What are we going to learn? And then I'll leave a direct link down below.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate that. Well, what the book will really show, it will highlight some of the differences between the presidents, but what it really will highlight is just how resistant the many in the career bureaucracy were to the Trump administration. And frankly, that was facilitated in many ways by the prior administration. It was facilitated by the effort you talked about in terms of the Russian hoax. From the minute Trump was elected, there was basically messaging that was like the bureaucracy should be resistant. And it was a stark contrast for me to see how, particularly in other agencies beyond Interior, the resistance was so different than even the Bush administration had experienced when I was there. And what my concern about that is if our civil service is ignoring the law and ignoring the will of the people, they're really not, hurting Trump. I mean, at the end of the day, Trump's administration may not be as effective as it otherwise would have been. But what they're really doing is they're negating the will of the American people. And we can't have a society, in my opinion, we can't have a society that says, let's go vote. And if you vote for the wrong party, your vote will be ignored over the next 4 years. There are 2.2 million civil servants, and there's generally about 3,000 to 4,500 political appointees. And for the nation to see the will of the people executed, it requires that those 2 million civil servants get with the program, the policy vision, not if you're asked to do something unlawful, that's one thing. And that's that you cannot carry out an unlawful order. But the civil service is obligated to work with the administration and carry out the will of the people. And if they don't, we have a situation that is really, really harmful, in my opinion, and very destabilizing. And so I try to highlight why we've gotten there, what I think what can be done about it. And there's a lot that can be done about it by the executive branch, by the legislative branch. And I am very hopeful that even the civil servants will realize as they look at this material what they need to do. And if our policymakers have the courage to demand that people behave and hold them accountable, we can very well have a government that does reflect the will of the people and provides better outcomes. And that's my hope, and that's why I put this material together. And I hope people have an opportunity to look at it and think about it.
Great. Well, thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for everything that you did. Hopefully, like you say, these things can be implemented and we can see. I don't know that we can handle another 4 years of Biden. So let's just see what ends up happening this November. But David, thank you so much for coming on. And